It began, as many endings do, in silence. The marble glistened under the Roman sun, the forum alive with the hum of voices, traders shouting, senators striding in their flowing togas, the smell of olive oil and ambition thick in the air. Rome, the Republic, the city that had defied kings, conquered tyrants, and built freedom into the heart of its laws. And yet, beneath the glitter of triumph, something unseen had begun to rot. How does a civilization that freed itself from monarchy slowly invite the shadows of tyranny back in? How does a people, once so proud of their liberty, trade it for the promise of order and power? The Roman Republic did not fall in a single day, nor by a single hand. It eroded, quietly, patiently, worn down by greed, by glory, and by the human hunger that has undone every empire before and since. It is easy to remember Rome as eternal. Marble columns, disciplined legions, the might of its laws stretching across the Mediterranean. But the Republic was mortal. Its greatness was not divine. It was built on the backs of men, flawed, ambitious, brilliant, and cruel. The same fire that had forged its rise would one day consume it. In the beginning, Rome was not a conqueror, but a survivor. The Republic was born out of rebellion, a people's rejection of kinship in 509 BCE. They swore that never again would one man hold the fate of all. 2 consuls, balanced by the Senate, bound by law, this was the heart of their dream. A world ruled not by whim, but by principle, and for centuries it worked, or seemed to. The Republic grew stronger with every war it fought, more confident with every victory. But each triumph carried a price. The spoils of conquest brought wealth, and with wealth came corruption. The legions, once citizen soldiers defending their homeland, became instruments of personal power. Commanders began to command loyalty not to the Republic, but to themselves. The balance that held Rome together began to tilt. You could hear the shift in the forum's whispers. Senators arguing not for justice, but for gain. Laws bent by favors. Bribes passed like greetings. You could see it in the eyes of the people. The plebeians, once proud of their civic duty, now drowning in poverty as estates grew larger, owned by the few. The Republic had conquered the world, but in doing so, it had conquered itself. Still, on the surface, the illusion of strength endured. Rome believed itself immortal. Its armies marched farther than ever. Its riches flowed endlessly from the provinces. But the marble was cracking. The Senate grew divided between the optimates, defenders of the aristocracy, and the populares, who claimed to speak for the common man. Each side justified its ambition as virtue. Each accused the other of treachery. The result was paralysis, and in paralysis, power found new ways to move. Because power, like water, always finds the cracks. And in Rome, the cracks were widening. As the Republic stretched its borders, its ideals could not stretch with them. The very system designed for a small city-state struggled to rule an empire. Decisions that once concerned local harvests now determined the fate of nations. And yet the same institutions, the same Senate, the same assemblies, were expected to govern it all. The machinery creaked under the strain. And in that strain, men of vision and ambition saw opportunity. The world beyond the Tiber was changing, and within it, so too were the hearts of men. The old virtues, pietas, gravitas, fides, the sacred duties of citizenship, honor, and loyalty began to fade. Wealth replaced service. Fame replaced duty. The Republic's greatest enemy was not foreign invasion, but internal decay, a slow corruption of the soul. It was as if the gods themselves had grown silent, watching as their chosen city began to devour itself. But even as the Republic trembled, there were still those who believed it could be saved, reformers, idealists, visionaries who thought they could restore balance to a system straining under its own triumphs. Among them rose 2 brothers, men who would challenge the very foundations of power, and in doing so, ignite the flames that would consume the Republic's peace forever. Their names would echo through history like omens: Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Before their rise, few could imagine that words spoken in the Senate could lead to rivers of blood in the streets. Yet it was through them that Rome's fracture became visible, the point where the Republic's ideals collided with its realities. They asked a question no one wished to hear: how long can a republic built on equality survive when wealth is its new god? The Gracchi would become both heroes and martyrs, symbols of a nation's conscience and its descent. For in the heart of every republic lies a paradox. The more it grows, the more fragile it becomes. Its people begin to see freedom not as a shared duty, but as a personal right. Its leaders, once servants of law, begin to see themselves as law itself. And so, like the slow shifting of tectonic plates, Rome's fate began to move, unseen, unstoppable. The marble city stood tall, its banners bright, its legions unmatched. But beneath the grandeur, something ancient and fragile was breaking. The faith that had bound citizen to city, the invisible covenant that made a republic more than a collection of laws. For the Romans had once believed that virtue's virtue was the lifeblood of the state. But when virtue turned to ambition and duty to greed, the republic's heartbeat faltered. It was not destroyed in an instant. It simply forgot how to live. And from that forgetfulness, the century of blood began. The year was 133 BCE. The city of Rome stood at the height of its glory, a superpower in all but name. Its armies had conquered from Spain to the Aegean, from the sands of Africa to the forests of Gaul. Yet within its walls, hunger gnawed. The republic's heart, beating beneath the stone and splendor, was weak. The spoils of conquest had not been shared equally. The few grew richer, the many poorer. Veterans returned from wars with nothing but scars, their farms swallowed by vast estates owned by the elite. And then came Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, a man born of noble blood, but guided by a dangerous compassion. He had seen, on his travels through Etruria, the empty fields where once free farmers had lived. He had seen slaves working the land that Romans had died to defend. And he asked the question that shook the Senate: was this the republic the ancestors had built? To many, Tiberius was a savior. To others, he was a heretic. He proposed a radical idea, the Lex Sempronia Agraria, a law to redistribute public land to the poor, to restore not only balance, but dignity. It was a return, he said, to the ancient virtues of Rome, when farmers were citizens and citizens were soldiers, and the republic belonged to all. But ideals are fragile things when they threaten power. The Senate, a fortress of the wealthy, resisted him with venom. They called him reckless, dangerous, even a tyrant in disguise. They whispered that his true ambition was the crown Rome had sworn never to wear again. And perhaps, in some small way, they were right, not because Tiberius sought to be king, but because he had underestimated how easily fear could turn freedom into fury. The forum that once echoed with debate now thundered with violence. Supporters of Tiberius clashed with senators' men. The marble steps of the Capitol, once sacred, became a battlefield. And there, in the chaos, reform met its end not through reason, but through blood. Tiberius Gracchus, tribune of the people, defender of the poor, was beaten to death with wooden clubs, his body thrown into the Tiber. A republic that had once prided itself on justice had silenced its conscience. But the spark could not be drowned. 10 years later, his younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, took up the cause. He was sharper, more determined, more aware of the Senate's cruelty. He sought not only to revive his brother's reforms, but to reshape the republic itself. Gaius built granaries, subsidized grain for the poor, and expanded citizenship to Rome's Italian allies, the very men who had fought and bled for the republic, but were denied its rights. For a moment, It seemed the tide might turn. But power, once challenged, never forgives easily. The Senate, terrified of losing control, painted Gaius as an enemy of the state, a revolutionary who sought to destroy the very republic he claimed to save. The confrontation came swift and merciless. The streets filled again with blood. Pursued by the Senate soldiers, Gaius fled to the temple of Diana. There, surrounded and cornered, he chose death over capture. A loyal slave ended his life with a blade. The reformers were gone, but what they revealed could not be unseen. The Gracchi brothers had exposed the wound, the great divide between the ideals of Rome and the reality of its rule. Their deaths marked the end of innocence for the Republic. Never again would politics be confined to words alone. From that day forward, Rome's destiny would be decided not by laws, but by men, and by the legions that followed them. The Senate celebrated its victory, believing it had preserved the old order. Yet in truth, it had signed its own death warrant. For every time reform was crushed, resentment deepened. Every injustice sowed another seed of rebellion. The Republic had chosen to bleed rather than bend. In the shadows of the Forum, where Tiberius had once spoken of justice, a new generation of men began to whisper different dreams of power, of glory, of vengeance. They would rise from the ranks of the army, not the Senate. Their loyalty would not be to Rome's laws, but to their commanders. The Republic had created its own executioners, and so the age of generals began. They came first as protectors, men like Gaius Marius, who promised stability through strength. Marius reformed the legions, opening their ranks to the poor, offering them pay, purpose, and the promise of land. To Rome's destitute, it was salvation. To the Republic, it was the beginning of dependence. For now the soldier's loyalty was no longer to the Senate or the people, but to the man who fed him, led him, rewarded him. The armies of the Republic became private armies in all but name. A balance of power tilted once more, not toward the people, but toward those who could command their swords. It is here that the Republic began to lose itself completely. The citizens who had once voted for leaders now marched for them. The city that had expelled kings now worshipped generals. The Senate that had ruled the world now ruled in fear of the men it had created. The Republic was not yet dead, but it was dying in spirit, torn between the dream of freedom and the reality of power. And in the distance, beyond the hills and marble and pride, thunder gathered. Rival generals would soon clash for Rome herself. The legions that had conquered the world would turn their spears upon their own homeland. The Republic's age of reform was over. Its age of civil war had begun. When Rome's soil grew too soaked with blood for seeds of reform to take root, another crop began to rise, a harvest of ambition. The age of ideals had ended. Now came the age of men. Men who would wield legions as instruments of will, not defense. Men who saw the Republic not as a sacred order, but as a battlefield for glory. The first among them was Gaius Marius, the soldier of the people. Born of modest origins, he was no patrician dreamer. He was a fighter who had clawed his way upward through the ranks. To the common man, he was proof that destiny could be earned. To the Senate, he was a threat wrapped in armor. Marius's reforms reshaped Rome's legions forever. No longer would soldiers need to own land to serve. Now the poorest citizens, the capitcensi, those who had nothing but their heads to count, could enlist. For the desperate, it was a miracle. Steady pay, plunder, the promise of land after service. For Marius, it was loyalty bought in blood. The Republic had always believed its army was the people in arms. But Marius had created something different, a new kind of soldier, bound not to the state, but to the general who led him. And so the seeds of civil war were sown. At first, it seemed Marius's brilliance would save Rome. His legions crushed foreign threats, the Numidian king Jugurtha, the fearsome Cimbri and Teutones, who had shattered Roman armies before him. Marius became a hero, the savior of the Republic. Crowds chanted his name. Statues rose in his honor. But power is a fire that rarely stays contained. The Senate, fearful of his growing influence, sought to curtail him. And in doing so, they turned the hero into something far more dangerous. A man who realized that the Republic's laws were not walls, but weapons to be used or broken. From the other side of the political divide came another figure, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. If Marius was the soldier of the people, Sulla was the champion of the old order. Elegant, ruthless, cunning, he represented the Senate's last attempt to hold back the tide. Yet fate would bind these two men together in a rivalry that would set Rome ablaze. Together, they had once fought as comrades. Together, they had triumphed. But ambition has no loyalty. When both laid claim to the same glory, the command of the war against King Mithridates of Pontus, the Republic itself became the prize. Sulla was given the command by the Senate. Marius, enraged, turned to the people, manipulating the assemblies to overrule it. For the first time in Roman history, politics became war. Sulla did the unthinkable. He marched his legions on Rome itself. The city that had once stood as the center of law was now a fortress under siege. The very soldiers who swore to defend her now trampled her streets under iron boots. Blood ran through the forum. The gods' temples echoed with the screams of citizens. Marius fled, but he would return, vengeance burning in his chest. While Sulla fought in the east, Marius seized power again, unleashing his own reign of terror. Lists of enemies were drawn, purges carried out. Senators were slaughtered, their property seized, their bodies displayed. When Sulla returned, victorious from his campaigns, he answered blood with blood. Another march on Rome. Another purge. Another descent into madness. For the Republic, it was no longer a government, only victors and victims. Sulla declared himself dictator re publicae constituende causa, dictator for the reformation of the Republic. The irony was bitter. He promised restoration, but delivered domination. He restructured the state, reduced the power of the tribunes, strengthened the Senate, and executed thousands in the name of stability. His proscriptions, public death lists, turned justice into spectacle. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Fortunes were made on corpses. The Republic, once proud of its laws, now wrote them in blood. And yet, Sulla believed he was saving Rome. He saw himself as a surgeon, cutting away the rot to preserve the body. In his mind, the Republic could be reborn through violence. But when his work was done, when his enemies lay buried and his power absolute, he did something no despot had ever done before. He resigned. He stepped down from dictatorship, retired to his villa, and died peacefully, as though the gods themselves had pardoned him. But the scar he left on Rome never healed. He had shown that power could be taken by force, that armies could decide politics, that law bowed before the sword. His example became a manual for the men who would follow. Because somewhere in the city, watching, learning, a young man took note of everything. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. He would remember Sulla's lessons, the fragility of the Senate, the loyalty of legions, the fickleness of the mob. He would remember that men who dared could bend history itself. And so the torch passed, from Marius to Sulla, from Sulla to Caesar. Each a product of the Republic's decay, each a chapter in its unraveling. By the time Sulla's ashes cooled, the Republic's fate was sealed. The Senate had lost its authority, the people their faith, the legions their neutrality. Power now lived in the hands of men who commanded armies, not arguments. The Republic was no longer a government. It was a battlefield, and Rome herself was the prize. And in the distance, beneath the murmurs of the Forum and the clash of ambition, a new generation sharpened its blades. For the men who would inherit Sulla's Rome were not statesmen or philosophers. They were conquerors in waiting, men whose names would become immortal, whose rivalry would tear the Republic apart. Pompey, Crassus, Caesar, 3 men, bound by ambition, destined for collision. And their alliance, forged in deceit and desperation, would bring the Republic to its knees. In the fading twilight of the Roman Republic, when the echoes of civil war still haunted its streets, and the Senate clung to the illusion of control, 3 men emerged who would redefine the balance of power or destroy it entirely. Their names would be spoken in awe and dread alike: Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Marcus Licinius Crassus, and Gaius Julius Caesar. Together they would form an alliance so audacious, so secretive, that Rome herself would become its hostage. But this was no brotherhood of ideals. It was a union of necessity, ambition, and envy, a pact forged in the shadows of betrayal and sealed by greed. Pompey was the Golden General. Once the protege of Sulla, he had conquered in Africa, crushed the pirates who plagued the seas, and brought the East under Roman dominion. The people adored him. Statues of Pompey stood across the city, his triumphs painted on the walls of the Forum. He was called Magnus, the Great, as though he were a god among mortals. Yet beneath his polished image lurked the wounded pride. The Senate, fearful of his popularity, refused to ratify his eastern settlements or grant his veterans their promised lands. Pompey, the conqueror of kings, found himself humiliated in his own city. Crassus, by contrast, was Rome's wealthiest man, a merchant of power who measured his worth not in titles, but in gold. He had built his fortune on the ruins of Sulla's prescriptions, buying confiscated estates for a pittance. His fire brigades would rush to burning homes, offering to purchase them before putting out the flames. To the Senate, he was indispensable. To the people, detested. Yet even Crassus, with all his riches, envied Pompey's fame. And then there was Caesar, younger, bolder, hungrier than them both. A man of charm and cunning, whose debts towered higher than his ambitions. And that was saying something. He was the nephew of Marius, the son-in-law of Cinna, the survivor of Sulla's purge. He had seen firsthand what ambition could cost, and yet he was willing to wager everything on it. Caesar's brilliance was not merely in battle, but in perception. He could see through the masks others wore. He understood Pompey's loneliness behind the laurel, Crassus's thirst beneath the wealth. He played them like instruments, tuning their desires until their discord became harmony for his purpose. And so, in 60 BCE, in the quiet halls of a private house, the first triumvirate was born. An informal alliance, no law, no decree, only a handshake and a promise. Pompey would have his settlements ratified. Crassus would gain financial relief for the tax collectors of Asia, and Caesar would secure the consulship, the highest office in the Republic. Together, they would bend Rome to their will. When Caesar stood for consul, the Senate trembled. They knew the man's charisma, his ability to turn the crowd into a chorus. He spoke not to the patricians, but to the masses. His words like fire poured into dry timber. The Optimates tried to block him, to silence him, but his partnership with Pompey and Crassus gave him the power to bulldoze through opposition. His co-consul Bibulus became a joke, mocked as the sky watcher because he would claim to see omens and refuse to act, while Caesar carried out every measure with unstoppable force. It was said that during their joint consulship, it was not the year of Caesar and Bibulus, but the year of Julius and Caesar. Caesar rewarded Pompey with the lands for his veterans, Crassus with his financial reforms, and himself with a proconsular command in Gaul, 5 years of absolute authority over an army, far from the Senate's reach. He left Rome not as a servant of the Republic, but as its rising master. In Gaul, Caesar's name would be reborn in blood and glory. While Rome squabbled, he conquered. His commentaries, written in the crisp precision of a soldier's pen, told tales of rivers run red, of tribes broken beneath the eagle's wings. He subdued the Helvetii, crushed the Belgae, humbled Vercingetorix, and the proud Gauls who dared to unite against him. Every victory brought treasure, slaves, and prestige, and every coin fed Caesar's machine of influence back in Rome. While his legions adored him, his enemies in the Senate whispered of tyranny. Meanwhile, in Rome, the triumvirate began to fray. Pompey had married Caesar's daughter, Julia, and for a time, affection softened their rivalry. But Julia's death in childbirth severed the bond. Crassus, ever eager for glory to match his wealth, embarked on a campaign against Parthia, the empire of the East. There, in the sands of Carrhae, his ambition met its end. His army was annihilated, his body desecrated, his severed head sent as mockery to the Parthian king. Now only two remained: Pompey, the idol of tradition, and Caesar, the champion of change. Their alliance had been a bridge built over fire, and with Crassus gone, the flames finally consumed it. The Senate, terrified of Caesar's growing power, turned to Pompey as their defender. They named him sole consul, a dictator in all but name, to restore order. Caesar, still in Gaul, saw the move for what it was: a betrayal. Letters crossed the Alps, filled with accusations and demands. The Senate ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. To obey meant death or disgrace. To refuse meant war. The choice was no choice at all. On a cold January night in 49 BCE, Caesar stood before the Rubicon River, the shallow stream that marked the legal boundary of his command. Beyond it lay Italy and treason. The water glistened under a pale moon as he paused, silent, thinking. Then, with words that would echo through the ages, he said, "Alia iacta est," the die is cast. He crossed the Rubicon, leading his legions toward Rome. The Republic had fallen into its final act. In the days that followed, Pompey fled south then east, gathering the Senate's forces to his banner. The world's greatest empire was now divided, brother against brother, citizen against citizen. Caesar would march to glory, Pompey to his fate. And as Rome burned in the crucible of civil war, the ideals that had once guided her, law, duty, balance, melted away like wax beneath the flame. For the Republic was no longer ruled by its people, but by the will of men who believed themselves destined to decide her future. The Rubicon's waters still whisper the memory of that night, the moment when one man's step shattered centuries of restraint. Julius Caesar, crossing with a single legion, did not merely march toward Rome. He marched into legend. Behind him, soldiers carried their standards high, not just as symbols of command, but of conviction. They were men who had followed him through the snows of Gaul and the blood of rebellion, who would follow him now, even into fratricide. Before them lay Italy, rich, frightened, and unprepared for war. Rome, an eternal mistress of dominion, had never imagined her own armies would turn upon her. The Senate, in panic, scattered like leaves before a storm. Many senators fled south with Pompey, believing they carried the Republic with them. But the Republic was already fading, its soul divided between two men who both claimed to defend it. Caesar advanced with speed and mercy. He captured city after city, not with fire, but with forgiveness. At Corfinium, he spared Domitius Ahenobarbus and his men, sending them home unharmed, a gesture that stunned the world. Where Sulla had prescribed, Caesar pardoned. It was a masterstroke of both strategy and symbolism. By presenting himself not as a conqueror, but as a savior, he claimed not only territory, but hearts. Pompey, however, was no fool, though Caesar's speed had taken him by surprise. The elder general commanded loyalty in the east, legions hardened by foreign campaigns, fleets that ruled the Mediterranean. He withdrew across the Adriatic, regrouping in Greece, where he could summon allies and starve Caesar's advance. Caesar, in turn, consolidated power in Italy, seized the treasury, and addressed the Senate. His tone was calm, almost sorrowful, as if he regretted the blood he knew must come. When spring came, the two titans met, not in Rome, but in the open plains of Epirus and Thessaly, where the fate of the Republic would be written in dust and blood. At Dyrrhachium, Pompey's legions outnumbered Caesar's 2-1. The older general's fortifications sprawled across the hills like a great iron serpent. Caesar, ever audacious, tried to encircle him, constructing walls around his enemy, a siege within a siege. The contest turned brutal, fought not just with swords, but with shovels, hunger, and endurance. Pompey broke through Caesar's lines, forcing him into retreat. For the first time in years, Caesar had tasted the bitterness of defeat. But he did not falter. "This man knows not how to win," he murmured of Pompey, "but I how to lose." It was not arrogance. It was prophecy. For Caesar's strength was not in brute force, but in will, in his ability to turn calamity into opportunity. He regrouped, drew Pompey inland, and chose the battlefield himself, a broad, wind-swept plain near the town of Pharsalus. The morning of battle dawned under a pale sun, veiled by dust and omen. Pompey commanded nearly twice Caesar's number. His cavalry, led by noblemen of Rome, gleamed like a silver tide. His strategy was simple: use his cavalry to outflank Caesar, break his line, and crush him utterly. Caesar, however, anticipated this. Quietly, he formed a hidden fourth line, a reserve of hardened veterans ordered not to throw their javelins, but to aim for the faces of Pompey's horsemen. It was a brutal, intimate tactic, designed not just to kill, but to terrify. When the horns of battle sounded, the earth trembled with the roar of legions. Pompey's cavalry charged, proud, confident, invincible, only to meet a wall of iron and resolve. The reserve line struck as one, their pila whistling through the air. The cavalry, unprepared for the savagery, faltered, broke, and fled. Pompey's infantry, seeing the collapse, hesitated, and in that heartbeat, Caesar's line surged forward. The slaughter was swift and terrible. Pompey's legions, once proud defenders of the Republic, now ran for their lives, trampled by their own comrades. By day's end, 20,000 lay dead upon the field. The dust of Thessaly drank deep of Roman blood. Pompey himself escaped the carnage, his cloak torn, his pride shattered. He fled to Egypt, to the court of young Ptolemy XIII, hoping for refuge from the boy king whose father he had once restored to power. But fortune, that cruel goddess, had abandoned him. When he arrived on the shore at Pelusium, Egyptian courtiers greeted him with smiles and promises, then struck him down as he stepped from his boat. His head was severed, his body left to drift upon the tide. When Caesar arrived days later, the Egyptians presented the severed head of Pompey Magnus as a gift. The conqueror turned away, weeping. "This was not how I wished to see the great Pompey," he said. The man who had been his rival in life became his tragedy in death. But even in mourning, Caesar moved with purpose. Egypt was no mere refuge. It was the heart of another empire, rich, strategic, and torn by civil war between Ptolemy XIII and his sister Cleopatra. Caesar, ever the opportunist, saw not chaos, but opportunity. He would side with Cleopatra, restore her to the throne, and entwine his destiny with hers in both politics and passion. In the golden halls of Alexandria, the two became legend. Cleopatra, draped in silk and wit, presented herself not as a supplicant, but as a goddess reborn, Isis to his Jupiter. Together, they forged an alliance that would reshape the world. Yet even as he lingered in Egypt, Rome burned with unrest. His enemies stirred in Africa and Spain, unwilling to yield. When he finally returned to Rome, it was as master, not consul. The Senate, cowed and weary, named him Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. The streets erupted with celebration, yet beneath the cheers lingered unease. The Republic's heartbeat had slowed to a whisper. The Senate still met, the laws still passed, but all eyes turned toward one man. And in that man's shadow, liberty began to fade. Caesar stood upon the steps of the Curia, draped not in armor, but in purple, the color of kings. His face, once that of a champion of the people, now seemed carved from marble, remote and divine. He had crossed rivers, mountains, and empires, but the final distance, from mortal to monarch, would prove the most perilous of all. For in the silence of the Senate, daggers were being sharpened, not for the tyrant he had become, but for the man he could no longer stop himself from being.
The city was still that morning, as though Rome herself were holding her breath. The marble temples gleamed beneath a pale spring sun, and the Tiber moved sluggishly, heavy with silt and silence. It was the 15th day of March, the IEDs, a date marked on every Roman calendar, yet remembered forever for only one reason. Caesar rose before dawn in his house on the Forum, restless. The dreams of the night clung to him like cobwebs. Calpurnia, his wife, had woken trembling, having seen his statue run with blood while the people washed their hands in it. She begged him not to go to the Senate that day. "Stay," she whispered. "There is danger in the air." Caesar, half amused, half weary, smiled and took her hand. "Cowards die many times before their deaths," he murmured. "The valiant never taste of death but once." He was not a man to cower before omens. Yet, even as he dressed, the purple cloak draped over his shoulders, the laurel crown upon his head, a shadow passed over his face. For a moment, perhaps, he felt the chill of destiny brushing against his skin. Outside, the streets were already filling with murmurs. Some whispered that Caesar intended to leave for Parthia soon, to avenge Crassus's defeat, but others, darker rumors, spoke of crowns, of kingship, of gods in human form. He was no longer merely consul or general. Statues of him stood beside those of Jupiter. His face adorned coins. Senators rose when he entered, not out of respect, but of fear. He had accepted the title dictator for life. The Republic, that ancient system of balance and restraint, now revolved around the will of one man. And yet that man, for all his glory, was still made of flesh and blood. As he walked toward the Curia of Pompey, the irony hung unspoken in the air. The Senate meeting was held in Pompey's theater, built by the very man whose head Caesar had once wept over. A statue of Pompey stood at the end of the hall, eyes cast down as though watching what would unfold. Around Caesar, the conspirators gathered like wolves in the guise of senators. Brutus, his one-time ally, and perhaps his son in spirit. Cassius, sharp and bitter. Decimus, trusted yet treacherous. Casca, whose hand would strike first. 60 men in all, bound not by loyalty but by fear, fear that Caesar's crown would become their chain. They called themselves liberatories, the liberators of Rome. But what is liberation when it is bought with blood? As Caesar entered, the room rose. He smiled, as always, confident in his invincibility. He took his seat beneath the statue of Pompey. The hum of conversation rippled, then fell away. A man approached with a petition, kneeling before him. Caesar waved it off impatiently. Another joined, then another, pressing close. The circle tightened. Suddenly, Casca pulled a dagger from beneath his toga and struck. The blade glanced off Caesar's shoulder. Caesar turned, stunned. "Casca, what is this violence?" he cried. But the answer came in silence, in still. One by one, the daggers flashed. Cassius, Decimus, Trebonius Metellus, each plunged their blades into him. He fought at first, eyes blazing, strength still in his limbs. But there were too many. Then he saw Brutus, his Brutus stepping forward, dagger trembling in his hand. The look between them needed no words. It was betrayal, written in human form. Et tu, Brute. He gasped, and whether it was reproach or forgiveness, no one could ever say. His toga, once imperial white, bloomed red with his blood. He staggered to the foot of Pompey's statue, clutching it as though seeking support from the past itself, and fell. 23 wounds. 1 silence. The Republics. Saviors stood trembling, their faces pale, their hands slick with history. For a heartbeat, they believed themselves heroes. But when they stepped out into the forum, expecting cheers, they were met with horror. The people who had once feared Caesar now mourned him. His death was not seen as liberation, but as sacrilege. Women wailed in the streets. Soldiers broke their swords in grief. The liberators had slain not a tyrant, but a god in the making. Antony, Caesar's loyal friend and co-consul, was the first to sense what the conspirators had failed to grasp. He did not strike back immediately. Instead, he cloaked his fury in composure, waiting for the moment when grief could become weapon. That moment came during Caesar's funeral. The crowd filled the forum until the marble steps seemed to tremble under the weight of humanity. Antony stood before them, holding the blood-stained cloak. His words began calm, measured the voice of reason mourning a friend. But as he spoke, the fire rose. He showed them the wounds, one by one. He named the men who had made them. He lifted the garments so all could see the rents and holes. And when he spoke Caesar's name, the crowd roared like thunder. "Here was a Caesar," he cried. "When comes such another?" The people, inflamed with sorrow and rage, surged toward the Senate houses. They set them ablaze. The liberators fled for their lives, their noble cause drowned in the fire of vengeance. Caesar's body was burned in the open air, his ashes scattered among the people. And as the flames rose, the Republic burned with him. From those ashes, 2 men emerged, both claiming his legacy: Mark Antony, the warrior of passion, and Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, a youth of quiet calculation. Together they would avenge him. Together they would pretend to restore what was lost. But Rome was no longer a republic of laws. It had become a theater of revenge. The Ides of March did not save Rome. It merely postponed her death. The dagger that sought to free the state instead carved the path to empire. And in the stillness after the storm, as the last smoke drifted above the Curia, one might almost imagine the spirit of Caesar whispering, not in anger, but in triumph. For though his body lay cold, his shadow had already begun to rise.
The flames of Caesar's pyre had barely faded when whispers began to swirl through the streets of Rome. Whispers of inheritance, destiny, and vengeance. Among the smoke and sorrow, a name emerged that few yet knew: Gaius Octavius. He was but 18, frail in frame, untested in war. Yet he bore a legacy written in Caesar's own hand. His will named this youth as his son and heir. When Octavian first returned to Rome from Apollonia, the people regarded him with curiosity rather than awe. He was no soldier, no orator, no seasoned senator. But in his eyes burned a clarity, cold and calculating, that few noticed and fewer survived. He came not to weep over Caesar's ashes, but to claim what the conqueror had left behind: his name, his fortune, and his unfinished empire. Rome at that moment was a wounded beast. The Senate, divided and fearful, had lost control. Antony, intoxicated by his own importance and by the fury of the mob he had roused, saw himself as Caesar's natural successor. He wore his mentor's laurel crown, sat in his golden chair, and demanded obedience as though power were his birthright. But power in Rome was never inherited. It was seized. Octavian watched Antony with quiet patience. He addressed him not as rival, but as ally, speaking with deference even as he measured the man's weakness. Antony underestimated him, laughing at the boy who called himself Caesar. But Octavian understood something Antony never could. Rome did not worship strength, It worshipped legitimacy. The name Caesar was no longer a man. It was a prophecy. While Antony feasted, Octavian went to work. He gathered Caesar's veterans with promises of vengeance and reward. Many had marched through Gaul and across the Rubicon under the old general's command, and they saw in Octavian the same gleam of destiny. With the wealth left to him in the will, he paid their loyalty in gold. In the streets, he walked humbly, speaking of duty to his father's memory. The people, still haunted by grief, rallied to his cause. By the summer of 43 BCE, the balance began to shift. The Senate, still wary of Antony's growing power, sought to use Octavian as a counterweight. They granted him imperium, command of troops, though he was barely of age to hold it. What began as a game of manipulation soon turned into a revelation. The boy was no pawn. Antony, meanwhile, had marched north, his army bloodied by a siege at Mytna. There, 2 consuls and a young general named Octavian joined forces against him. The battle raged for days, fierce and unforgiving. Antony's lines eventually broke, his forces scattered. He fled across the Alps, seeking refuge with Lepidus, another of Caesar's former lieutenants. But victory brought no peace. The Senate, arrogant in its triumph, treated Octavian not as a hero, but as a tool to be discarded. They refused him honors, ignored his demands, and plotted to strip him of command. It was the last mistake they would ever make. In the night, Octavian marched his legions toward Rome. No blood was spilled, none needed to be. The Senate woke to find the city surrounded by Caesar's soldiers, their shields glinting in the dawn. Octavian entered unopposed. He demanded and received the consulship. Rome had been conquered once again, not by force, but by finesse. Still, Antony was not gone. In the east, he rebuilt his strength, gathering loyalists and the remnants of his shattered legions. Octavian knew that open war would destroy them both and doom the Republic forever. So he offered peace, or the illusion of it. In late 43 BCE, at Bologna, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus met. Together, they formed the Second Triumvirate, a legal dictatorship of 3 men, tasked with restoring order to the state. But restoration was a word soaked in blood. The triumvirs began their rule with prescriptions, a grim echo of Sulla's purge. Lists of names were posted in the forum: senators, equestrians, enemies, and rivals. Their properties were seized, their lives forfeit. Cicero, that brilliant voice of the Republic, was among them. He had spoken too freely against Antony, too warmly of liberty. When they found him fleeing along the coast, he bared his throat to the soldiers. "There is nothing proper in what you do," he told them, "but do try to kill me properly." His hands, the hands that had written the fate of Rome, were nailed to the rostra. Octavian read the names in silence. His face revealed nothing, but his heart hardened. The Republic was gone. Its ideals were corpses nailed beside Cicero's. What remained was survival and purpose. Once their enemies were purged, the triumvirs divided the world like spoils. Antony took the east, rich with gold and grain; Lepidus, the neglected Africa; and Octavian, the west, Italy, Gaul, and the weary heart of Rome. On parchment, they were equals. In truth, each watched the others with suspicion. Antony, the soldier, sought glory. Octavian, the statesman, sought control. Lepidus, the shadow, sought to survive. But destiny, that patient architect, builds empires with rivalry as its mortar. Antony sailed eastward, to the marble palaces of Alexandria, where he met the woman who would alter not only his fate, but Rome's itself, Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. Her presence was a weapon as potent as any sword. Her eyes held the Nile and the desert, her voice the promise of kingdoms. Antony, who had once shared Caesar's ambition, now shared his lover. Their union scandalized Rome. Cleopatra was seen not as a queen, but as an enchantress, a foreign seductress who had ensnared the guardian of Rome's east. Octavian, ever the strategist, saw opportunity. He bided his time, building roads, repairing order, and whispering to the Senate that Antony had betrayed them, that he had become an Eastern monarch in Roman clothing. The Republic had become a mirror maze of illusion and rhetoric, a theater of ideals masking the hunger for dominion. In that theater, Octavian played his role to perfection. While Antony sent letters signed as Dionysus, Octavian spoke of duty, tradition, and Rome. And when he stood before the people, with his calm voice and unyielding eyes, they did not see a conqueror. They saw stability. The second triumvirate would not last forever. Like all pacts built on fear, it would dissolve in blood. But in its ashes, the seed of empire was taking root. And as the tides of the Tiber lapped softly against the banks of the city, one could almost hear the whisper of the old republic fading, not with a scream, but with a sigh. For Rome no longer belonged to its Senate, its laws, or its gods. It belonged to a name, Caesar, and in the hands of Octavian, that name would become eternal. The fragile peace of the triumvirate, born of necessity and stained with blood, began to unravel almost as soon as it was signed. 3 men had sworn to restore order to Rome, but Rome was too small for 3 masters. Lepidus faded first, ambitious enough to covet power, but too timid to seize it. His legions deserted him the moment Octavian raised his standard, leaving him alive only because Octavian deemed him harmless. 2 remained. Antony in the east, Octavian in the west. 2 heirs of Caesar. One ruled with passion, the other with precision. One worshipped the goddess of love, the other served the god of order. Antony's world was gilded, perfumed, and sun-drenched. Egypt, where time moved to the rhythm of the Nile. There, in the marble halls of Alexandria, Cleopatra awaited him. When he entered her presence, the conqueror of Parthia became her captive. She received him as Isis reborn, seated beneath a canopy of gold, her throne surrounded by clouds of incense. Antony, hardened by years of war, fell to his knees not as a general, but as a man bewitched. Their love was both genuine and political. Cleopatra sought to restore the glory of Egypt and the power of her dynasty through Rome's strongest man. Antony sought a crown greater than any Ramam could wear, not a consulship or dictatorship, but an empire stretching from the Tiber to the Nile. Together, they imagined a new order, East and West united under their children, heirs to both Caesar's blood and Egypt's divine lineage. But in Rome, such dreams were poison. Octavian watched from afar, patient as ever. He understood that Antony's passion would destroy him faster than any sword. And so, with a precision that bordered on artistry, he began to craft a story, one that would turn Rome against its own hero. He gathered Antony's letters, intercepted messages, and planted whispers in the Senate. He spoke not of war, but of loyalty, of how Antony had abandoned his Roman wife, Octavia, Octavian's own sister, for a foreign queen, of how Cleopatra had called herself Queen of Kings, of how Antony now styled himself Dionysus, living in drunken luxury while Roman soldiers languished unpaid. It was not the truth that mattered, it was the theater of it. In 32 BCE, Octavian made his boldest move yet. He broke into the temple of the Vestal Virgins and seized Antony's will, claiming divine justification. He read it aloud before the Senate, his voice calm, deliberate. The document, whether genuine or forged, declared that Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra. To the Romans, this was treason of the soul. Antony had not merely betrayed Rome. He had fallen in love with her enemy. The Senate, enraged and afraid, declared war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. It was a masterstroke of propaganda. Rome could not fight its own, but it could fight a foreign queen. Octavian, the defender of Roman virtue, would now march against decadence, treachery, and the East itself. The stage was set for the last act of the Roman Republic. Antony gathered his forces, legions loyal to him, fleets from the eastern provinces, and the wealth of Egypt. Cleopatra sailed at his side, her flagship glinting with gold and purple sails. In command, Antony was still formidable. His soldiers adored him, his captains respected him. Yet within him burned the quiet dread of a man who suspects the gods have turned away. Their fleets met in the Ionian Sea, near a small promontory called Actium. It was September 2nd, 31 BCE. The morning sun glinted on the water like a blade. Antony's fleet was vast, his ships towering and heavily armed. Octavian's, smaller and swifter, commanded by his brilliant Admiral Agrippa, danced like wolves around a bull. For hours the battle raged, oars splintering, arrows hissing, fire ships setting the waves alight. The air filled with the roar of men and the shrieks of the dying. Then, in the chaos, Cleopatra's flagship turned away, her sails unfurling toward the open sea. What happened next remains one of history's great mysteries. Some say she panicked. Others claim Antony, seeing her flee, abandoned the fight to follow her. Whatever the truth, his departure shattered his lines. His fleet surrendered or burned where it stood. The sea that had once carried Rome's ambition now carried its ruin. Octavian's victory at Actium was not just a triumph of arms, it was a triumph of narrative. In a single stroke, he had cast Antony and Cleopatra as symbols of corruption, while he himself became the savior of Roman virtue. But the story was not yet over. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria. There, in the fading light of their doomed kingdom, they clung to each other as the world closed in. The libraries still whispered with scholars. The temples still burned incense, but the air was thick with despair. Rome was coming. In the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian's legions marched through the desert and laid siege to the city. The once proud Antony, betrayed by his allies, fought his last battle at the gates of his palace. His cavalry deserted, his infantry scattered. When he heard a false report that Cleopatra had taken her own life, he fell upon his sword. As his lifeblood drained away, he was carried to the queen's chamber. Cleopatra, pale and trembling, cradled him in her arms. He died there, whispering her name, the final echo of a love that had outlived empires. Octavian entered Alexandria soon after. He found Cleopatra in her mausoleum, draped in royal robes, her eyes burning with defiance. She tried once to charm him, as she had charmed Caesar and Antony, but Octavian was made of colder metal. He offered her mercy, the humiliation of a Roman triumph paraded in chains before the mob. She declined. Days later, she prepared herself for death, as if for a coronation. Surrounded by gold, she lay upon a couch of purple silk. In her hand, a basket of figs, and hidden within, the asp. When the serpent struck, her breath slowed. The last pharaoh of Egypt died as she had lived, regal, theatrical, and unyielding. Octavian stood over her body in silence. The world had lost its last great queen, and he, its last great rival. He ordered her to be buried beside Antony, as her wish demanded. Then he turned his gaze to the horizon. The age of kings was ending. The age of emperors was about to begin. When he returned to Rome, the city erupted in celebration. The gates of Janus, symbol of war, were closed for the first time in a generation. The Senate hailed him as savior, the people as peacemaker. But peace, as Octavian knew, is merely another form of control. He took no crown, no title of king, only a name. Augustus. It meant the revered one. And under that name, he would reshape Rome from a republic of men into an empire of gods. The world had been conquered not by a sword, but by a will. And the boy who had once been dismissed as Caesar's fragile heir now stood as master of all things. The republic was dead. Rome, eternal. Rome stood in a strange silence after the storm. Its streets, once echoing with the cries of civil war, now carried the murmur of rebuilding. The blood of decades had soaked the soil, and from that soil something new began to grow, not the wild vine of a republic, but the carefully tended garden of empire. Octavian, now Augustus, understood what no one before him had grasped, that power did not need to be declared to be absolute. It could hide beneath the robes of tradition, behind the marble of old institutions. The Senate still met, the consuls still gave speeches, the people still cheered at the games. But every decision, every law, every command ultimately flowed from one source. The quiet figure who sat at the heart of it all, he did not call himself king. Rome despised kings. But he wore the invisible crown of control. He called his rule the Principate, the government of the first citizen. It was a lie so elegant, it became truth. In the marble forum, where Caesar had once fallen, the people erected statues to Augustus. They hailed him as Pater Patriae, father of the fatherland. He accepted their devotion with a modest smile, as if embarrassed by their praise. But he was not embarrassed. He was building eternity. The Republic had died, but Augustus gave the illusion that it still lived. He kept its rituals, the elections, the Senate, the consuls, but stripped them of danger. The Senate was filled with men loyal to him, men who owed their wealth, their positions, even their lives to his favor. Votes were cast, but only for choices he permitted. The people shouted in the Circus Maximus, but their voices were an echo in a vast chamber he had already sealed. And Rome, exhausted by chaos, welcomed it. The people did not cry for liberty. They cried for bread, for peace, for predictability. Augustus gave them all three. He rebuilt aqueducts, restored temples, and filled the streets with marble. He transformed Rome from a city of brick into a city of stone. But his true genius lay not in building walls, but in building myths. He rewrote the story of Rome itself. In Virgil's Aeneid, commissioned under his reign, Rome was no longer the accidental product of conquest and ambition. It was destiny, the will of the gods made manifest. Aeneas, the Trojan refugee, was portrayed as the ancestor of Augustus, chosen by fate to found a civilization that would rule the world. Through poetry and art, Augustus turned history into prophecy fulfilled. Even his bloodline became sacred. He claimed descent from Venus through Aeneas, making himself a living bridge between mortal and divine. His adopted son Tiberius would inherit not merely power, but sanctity. The emperor was no longer just ruler. He was the embodiment of Rome's eternal will. And yet beneath the marble calm, there was unease. Those who remembered the old days, the fiery debates of the Senate, the voices that once dared to challenge tyranny, whispered that something precious had been lost. Liberty, once the soul of Rome, had become a ghost wandering its colonnades. Cicero was gone, Brutus was gone, Cato was gone. Only their statues remained, eyes cast toward a future that no longer belonged to them. But for the new generation, Augustus' world was paradise. The legions, once restless and mutinous, were settled along the frontiers, from the Rhine to the Euphrates. Roads stretched across continents, binding the empire like veins. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, descended like a great sigh upon the world. For 2 centuries, the Mediterranean would know stability unmatched in history. Merchants sailed from Spain to Syria, carrying olive oil, glass, and silk. Farmers in Gaul sent wine southward. Scribes in Alexandria copied the philosophies of Greece onto papyrus that would reach Britain. From the deserts of Arabia to the forests of Germania, a single law, a single coin, a single language began to weave the fabric of empire. But peace has a cost. To maintain this order, Augustus built the most efficient bureaucracy the world had ever seen, a machine of taxation, census, and surveillance. Every road led not just to Rome, but to his authority. The legions swore not to the Senate, not to the Republic, but to him personally. Each oath tightened his grasp. Each triumph made his image divine. And yet, he ruled with restraint, or at least the appearance of it. His power was absolute, but his touch was soft. He exiled rather than executed, persuaded rather than crushed. He played the role of reluctant master, always insisting he served the state. It was this theater of humility that made him invincible. Still, in his private moments, Augustus knew that time itself was his enemy. He had watched Caesar die for being too bold, Antony for being too human. He would die for being too mortal. So he worked not only to rule, but to endure. He ensured that his name would not perish when his body did. Every arch, every statue, every temple whispered Augustus. Even the calendar itself bore his mark. The 8th month, once Sestilis, was renamed in his honor, August. Time now bent around his legacy. As his reign stretched into decades, the people forgot what freedom had felt like. Children were born who knew no Rome without Augustus. They grew to see him as both protector and God. When he finally died in 14 CE, the city wept as though the sun itself had fallen from the sky. But in truth, something deeper had ended. The last breath of a Rome that had once been a republic of citizens, not subjects. In his will, Augustus declared that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Yet the marble was more than stone. It was silence solidified. The Senate still met, but only to applaud. The elections continued, but only to confirm. The people still cheered, but only as echo. The Republic had been buried not by violence, but by peace. Still, in that peace, Rome achieved what no civilization before it had, a unity so vast it seemed eternal. From the sands of Africa to the hills of Britannia, a single name commanded loyalty. The eagle standards gleamed beneath the sun, and the legions marched to the beat of destiny. But even as the empire reached its golden dawn, shadows gathered beyond the horizon. In the forests of the north, where barbarians whispered of vengeance, and in the hearts of Romans themselves, where ambition, once suppressed, began again to stir. The Roman Empire had been born, but like all living things, it carried within it the seeds of decay. And so, even as Augustus' funeral pyre blazed against the twilight, a question lingered in the smoke. Had Rome truly triumphed, or merely transformed its chains? In the years that followed Augustus' death, the fire that had burned so brightly began to flicker and shift. The emperor had built a system meant to endure beyond his own life, but no mortal hand can bind the ambitions of men forever. His chosen heir, Tiberius, ascended to the purple, not with applause, but with unease. A soldier, a recluse, and a man haunted by the ghost of a father he could never surpass. Tiberius ruled as a shadow of the first emperor. He possessed none of Augustus' charm, none of his careful balance between tyranny and mercy. Where Augustus had ruled through illusion, Tiberius ruled through fear. He distrusted the Senate, avoided the people, and eventually withdrew to the cliffs of Capri, leaving Rome in the grip of informants and spies. The machinery Augustus had built for control now began to feed on itself. Yet, even in decay, the system functioned. The legions still obeyed, the provinces still sent their taxes, the empire still pulsed with wealth. Rome had outgrown the need for great men. It had become an organism of its own. Bureaucracy replaced inspiration. Power had become routine. The Republic's old ideals, virtues, libertas, gravitas, were still spoken, but as hollow echoes in marble halls. Senators praised emperors not for wisdom, but for survival. Loyalty was measured not by truth, but by flattery. The empire had traded the storms of freedom for the calm of obedience. And yet, beneath that calm, something darker stirred. The emperors who followed, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, revealed what happens when divine power rests in human hands too long. Caligula, once hailed as a God-sent heir, descended into madness, demanding worship, killing on whim, and declaring his horse a consul. Claudius, though learned and cunning, ruled through manipulation, surrounded by courtiers who saw in his frailty a path to their own advancement. And Nero, the artist emperor, burned Rome itself and sang as it fell, believing that destruction was merely another form of creation. Each ruler chipped away at the illusion Augustus had built. The empire that had promised eternal peace now trembled under its own decadence. But even in its worst moments, the machine endured. When Nero fell, chaos briefly returned. Generals rose, legions fought legions, blood once again ran through the Forum. Yet within a year, order was restored. The empire did not collapse. It adapted. That was Rome's greatest strength, not its laws, not its armies, but its capacity to survive its own corruption. Under the Flavians and later the Antonines, the empire found stability once more. Roads were repaired, frontiers strengthened, and trade revived. The Colosseum rose from Nero's ashes, a monument both to Roman grandeur and Roman cruelty. Tens of thousands cheered as gladiators bled for spectacle, their deaths choreographed as offerings to the empire's own myth of might. By the time of Trajan and Hadrian, Rome reached its zenith. From Scotland's misted hills to the sands of Arabia, one world stretched under one rule. The Pax Romana became not just peace, but an identity. To be Roman was to belong to something larger than life itself. In marble cities across continents, temples to Jupiter and Venus stood beside forums and baths, the smell of olive oil mingling with incense and sweat. Aqueducts carved across valleys carried the breath of civilization itself. Water, the pulse of Rome. Hadrian, philosopher and wanderer, sensed both the power and fragility of what had been built. He traveled the empire's vast roads, touching its edges, understanding that empires survive not only by conquest, but by memory. He ordered the building of walls, most famously in Britannia, not merely to keep enemies out, but to define what was within. Rome, once boundless, was learning the limits of its reach. Yet even in triumph, the seeds of decline continued to germinate. The same order that had brought prosperity also bred complacency. Generations born in peace forgot the price their ancestors had paid for it. Citizens became subjects, subjects became dependents. The spirit that had once defied kings now worshipped them. Philosophers began to ask dangerous questions, not about politics, but about meaning. Stoics like Seneca and later, Marcus Aurelius spoke of virtue not as power but as restraint, of greatness not as conquest but as endurance. They tried to restore the moral backbone of Rome, but their words could not turn the tide of decadence. The empire had become too vast, too dependent on its own inertia. By the 2nd century, Rome stood like a titan grown weary of its own size. Its roads still gleamed, its legions still marched, but its heart beat slower. The Senate's debates had turned into ceremony. The emperor's word had become law. The people no longer cared who ruled, so long as the grain arrived and the games continued. And yet, for all its flaws, the empire represented something magnificent, the culmination of humanity's will to organize, to build, to endure. From the ruins of the Republic had arisen a civilization so mighty, it seemed to defy the laws of history. But history does not forget. It only waits. For beyond the Rhine and the Danube, in forests where Rome's banners had never flown, tribes watched and waited. To the east, new powers gathered in the shadow of Persia. And within, the weight of luxury and bureaucracy began to rot the foundations unseen. Still, in the golden twilight of the Antonine Age, it was easy to believe that Rome would last forever. The marble glowed in the sunset. The statues of emperors stood proud and serene. The people believed themselves eternal. But eternity is a dangerous illusion. For the same forces that once destroyed the Republic, ambition, corruption, and the hunger for control still lived within the veins of empire. The Republic had fallen not because men desired tyranny, but because they desired stability. The empire would one day fall for the same reason. The lesson was there, carved into the stones of the Forum, whispered through the corridors of the Senate. When a people surrender freedom for the promise of order, they inherit neither. And so, even at the height of its power, Rome's future was already written, not in ink, but in human nature. For empires, like men, do not die in a single moment. They decay in whispers, in complacency, in the quiet erosion of purpose. The Republic's fall had not ended with Augustus. It merely changed its shape. Rome had survived its own transformation, but for how long could it survive itself? Time, that silent conqueror, moved over Rome like the shadow of an eclipse. Centuries passed, emperors rose and fell, and still the city endured. An empire that seemed immortal, it was always dying a little more with each triumph. The marble that Augustus had laid began to crack. Ivy climbed the walls where senators once debated the fate of nations. The world was changing, and Rome, the eternal, began to fade beneath its own weight. The Republic that had once been, that restless heartbeat of freedom, ambition, and argument, was now a ghost that lingered in memory and myth. The citizens of this later Rome no longer called themselves masters of their own fate. They were subjects, living in the shadow of power they could no longer touch. The word res publica, the public thing, had become a relic carved on broken monuments and forgotten by the living. And yet, the dream of the Republic never truly vanished. It slept beneath the marble, like an ember beneath ash. When Marcus Aurelius came to power in the 2nd century, he ruled not only as an emperor, but as a philosopher, perhaps the last Roman who truly understood the fragility of greatness. In his meditations, written not for glory, but for solitude, he confessed the truth that Rome itself had long denied, that all empires are mortal. The universe is change. He wrote, "Life is opinion." He ruled wisely, but he could not rule the tides of time. His death in 180 CE marked the end of an age, the passing of Rome's last philosopher king. What followed was a slow unraveling. His son, Commodus, born to luxury and worship, mistook the empire for his personal stage. He dressed as Hercules, fought in the arena, renamed Rome after himself, not out of reverence for its past, but out of contempt for its restraint. In him, the Republic's ideals were not merely forgotten, they were mocked. The Senate, powerless and humiliated, watched in silence as madness sat on the throne. When Commodus was finally murdered, it was not justice that replaced him, but chaos. Generals declared themselves emperors. Provinces broke faith with the center. The empire, once united under the illusion of order, was now splintering beneath the weight of ambition. The Republic had fallen once through the hunger for power. The empire would now fall through the same hunger multiplied, 100-fold. And yet, somehow, Rome survived again. Diocletian restructured its government. Constantine shifted its capital to the east, founding a new Rome on the Bosporus. The Senate still met, but now it met in echo. But now for emperors who wore crowns like burdens. The gods themselves changed. Jupiter gave way to Christ. Temples became churches. And the empire that had once deified men now bowed to the divine. It was a transformation, both profound and inevitable. For the Roman spirit had never been about marvel or conquest. It was about endurance. When the Western Empire finally crumbled in 476 CE, when barbarian kings sat on Roman thrones, something of Rome still lived on, in its laws, its language, its vision of civilization. Every republic that came after, from the marble halls of Florence to the chambers of Philadelphia, carried in its bones the memory of that first experiment in shared power, that fragile, impossible dream that men could govern themselves. The Republic's fall had been a tragedy, but also a lesson, a mirror held up to humanity's eternal struggle between freedom and control, chaos and order. Rome had proven that greatness and corruption are twins, born of the same fire. The same ambition that builds an empire can destroy it. The same discipline that preserves liberty can harden into tyranny. And still, the story endures. In the ruins of the Forum, where stray cats prowl between broken columns, you can almost hear the ghosts of senators arguing beneath the sun. The air smells faintly of dust and time. The wind carries whispers of Latin phrases, once spoken with conviction and fear. Tourists pass, cameras in hand, unaware that they walk on the bones of a dream, the dream of a republic that sought to outlive the gods. Each fallen column, each weathered statue is a fragment of that eternal question. Can power ever belong to all? The Romans themselves never answered it. Their republic fell because it forgot what it was meant to protect, not its territory, not its glory, but its citizens. When law became a tool of ambition, when freedom became a luxury, when fear replaced trust, the republic collapsed not from without, but from within. And so, the story of Rome is not simply the story of one civilization as fall. It is the story of every civilization as reflection. For power always tempts, and liberty always slips away quietly, disguised as order, as safety, as peace. Even today, the words of Cicero echo faintly across time. The welfare of the people is the ultimate law. But he did not live to see how easily that law can be twisted, how often the people themselves trade their welfare for the comfort of obedience. The Roman Republic died not because men stopped believing in it, but because they stopped defending it. And yet, its echo lingers in our laws, our languages, our architecture, our politics. Every Senate chamber, every constitution, every citizen has right to speak without fear. All are built upon the memory of a Rome that refused to die completely. For perhaps that is the truest legacy of the Republic, not permanence, but resilience. The idea that even in ruin, ideals can endure. As the sun sets over the Tiber, the city glows like embers in the twilight. Bells ring from churches that stand atop temples that once belonged to forgotten gods. The air is thick with the scent of rain and stone, the perfume of eternity. And in that fading light, one can almost imagine the voice of Rome itself, weary, wise, unbroken, whispering across the centuries. I was not built to last forever. I was built to be remembered. The marble cracks, the empires fall, the names fade into dust. But the question remains, the same one that haunted Rome from its first triumph to its final breath. What, truly, is the price of power? And when we finally pay it, what remains of us?